Welcome back. We are going to begin our next session. We're still waiting for one speaker, Chris Burbank, who hasn't connected yet, but I think because we're all on a tight schedule, we want to make the trains run on time. So I think we'll start now with our second session. This is session 5 on policing and public safety. We have a full complement of speakers with us, and so excellent ones, as you'll see. And to lead us, we're really honored to have Christina Leonard, who is the executive editor of Cronkite News, which is a student-produced news division of Arizona PBS. Those of you who watch PBS will know the great quality of the material that comes across every night, thanks to the Cronkite School, and I guess thanks to Christina. So Christina, over to you, and you can start. Welcome.
All right, thank you for that introduction. I'm glad that you are a Cronkite News fan. Awesome to hear. All right, so I'm first of all, I just have to say I am thrilled to join this panel. I started my career as a criminal justice reporter more than 20 years ago, and did it for several years. It was one of my favorite beats. I've always found it fascinating, the systems, the people, the policies, the politics, everything about it. So this is just a real treat for me to delve into this world again. So I'm joined by 4 distinguished panelists with extensive experience and expertise. You can find their full biographies in your packets. So the format of this session is much like the other sessions. Very simple. We're going to introduce the panelists and ask them to give us a brief overview of their perspectives, and we'll open it up to some questions. And we'd love to use this opportunity to have a robust dialogue as opposed to lectures or anything like that. All right, so let's start with the topic of this panel as it was pitched to me, which was balancing policing and public safety. So I imagine there could be a variety of interpretations to that, but I love to explore this issue of police effectiveness versus the idea of fair policing. And I'd love to begin with Chief Andre Anderson, who is the newly appointed chief of the Rochester Police Department. Congratulations, I hope. He also served as interim police chief of the Ferguson Police Department in Missouri. And since we're in the Southwest, I have to mention, and please correct me if my information is wrong, but he's also worked at the Arizona Department of Corrections, the Phoenix, Tulsa, and Glendale Police Department. So you've made your rounds in the Southwest as well. So, Chief Anderson, I feel like this is a gross understatement to say this, but you have no doubt seen a lot in your career, and you've stepped right into the fray as a leader in, these momentous times. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen in terms of the changes in policing and that evolution, we can call it that, and characterize where you think we are right now at this moment?
Sure. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, Christina, and this distinguishing guest. You have a fantastic panel here. There's some changes as we see in law enforcement, and I'm going to provide a couple some facts that we all know about, and then answer your question really quickly. I ask this question from time to time, realizing we have 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the country. Over 420,000 police officers. And in this country, we make more than 10 million arrests a year. We have the highest incarceration rate in the world in this country. So one might ask the question is making arrests effective? Are we doing a good job at that? Is it changing anything? And so when we speak in terms of balancing policing, I'm often reminded that community policing has a great deal to do with, yes, enforcement is part of our job, yet balancing policing is getting the community involved in taking measures to help assist in our crime fighting efforts, which allows for us to use wraparound services to identify people as we get into the communities to help them get out of their circumstances, and to balance the community's need to help with policing. And it's a change with respect to getting police officers to see how critically important it is for us to help people. We know that's important, but we have to take that as a priority in our policing efforts, and we have to work to allow many experts in the field to come and assist us.
Okay, great. All right, it looks like Chris has not joined us, right? So let's go to Marc Levin, the former Chief of Policy and Innovation for the Right on Crime Initiative at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. So the description says that the initiative has become a clearinghouse for conservative criminal justice reforms and has contributed to policy changes in dozens of states. Can you talk a little bit more about policy specifically and what's the initiative's next big push?
Well, I'm really delighted to say I recently joined the Council on Criminal Justice as Chief Policy Counsel, and I'm still engaged with Right on Crime, which I developed the concept for in 2010, and I'm Senior Policy Advisor now to Right on Crime. But both organizations certainly are focused on policing reform. And, you know, we're, of course, talking today at the trial of George Floyd. And I think that it's clear that there has been a reckoning in this country around both policing and race that's long been needed. And I think that there's a lot of reason to be encouraged. Many police departments and many states have adopted significant reforms just in the last year, including around improving police training, de-escalation tactics, alternatives to police in terms of responding to certain calls, wellness checks, mental health calls. I think many of you saw the study in Colorado, 748 calls handled by mental health crisis providers with not a single injury or crisis. Or, you know, no one was either a mental health provider or an individual was injured, and they got the help that was needed. And you know, of course, an officer could be called as backup when it was necessary. But it does demonstrate that, as former David Brown, who was formerly the Dallas police chief, now Chicago, he said often that we ask police to do too much sometimes. And I think most police chiefs around the country that I talk to, they're very much welcoming the additional resources, whether it's towards dealing with overdoses, mental health, people experiencing homelessness. So I think that unfortunately the defund the police you know, language was really a misnomer, but when you actually break down and say, do we want to augment the traditional role of police, which is still needed, especially when it comes to serious and violent conduct, with a broader toolbox that is supported across the spectrum. And so we have the policing task force with the Council on Criminal Justice now that has released recommendations on duty to intervene and getting rid of chokeholds and other unnecessary and dangerous practices. So I think that we really have a solid base of research and experience to build on.
All right, thank you for that. All right, and now let's turn to Ben McJunkin. Did I say your name right? Yes, awesome, my fellow Sun Devil. All right, so Ben is the Associate Deputy Director of the Academy of Justice at ASU, an Associate Professor of Law. At the Academy of Justice, when I looked it up, it said the vision is a criminal justice system where actual practices correspond with best practices as determined by fact-based, nonpartisan academic research. That sounds lovely. Can you talk a little bit more about the research end of it and what you all do? And you know, because there's so many journalists here, anything new or significant out there that we should be paying attention to?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about it. And first of all, just thank you all for having me here. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. So what the Academy for Justice does is we're focused on legal scholarship in particular. Too often what happens in academia is we all end up sort of sitting in our offices, coming up with great ideas, writing articles that only get read by each other. We don't do as much real world fact-based research as we probably ought to. And to the extent that we do, that information doesn't get made accessible to the public or to policymakers. And so the goal of the Academy for Justice is in some sense to try to find ways to translate what's happening already in academia and get those ideas into the hands of people who on the ground could make meaningful changes. We've done that in a number of different ways. We hold a bunch of events that sort of try to bring attention to new research, but we're also engaged in sort of cutting edge research of our own. A small example of this is something that we're doing right now. In fact, we're working closely with a professor at NAU and another institute here in Arizona, the Grand Canyon Institute, to potentially look into issues around the way in which Tempe is initiating calls for service, right? The Tempe Police Department, and whether or not there's avenues there for them to reform the types of services that they're providing, or to potentially relocate some of the services that they're offering to community-based organizations, rather than put so much work on sort of the brunt of police, right? Which is one of the things, I mean, you've heard both Chief Anderson and Mr. Levin talk about here, which is that we ask police to do too much in this country. This is one of the issues that we consistently run into. And what's challenging in part is that as a law professor, my goal and my area of specialty is really focusing on sort of the way in which we can regulate police legally. And it turns out that legal reforms have done far too little. There's not enough legal control over police. Constitutionally, our laws offer police substantial discretion with respect to things like deadly force, when to get involved in things like stop and frisk. They actually permit a certain level of intentional and sometimes unintentional racial bias. We know that civil lawsuits and prosecutions are potential accountability mechanisms that could happen after the fact, but for various reasons that we can talk about, those have been relatively ineffective. And so a panel like this is a really interesting opportunity for someone who focuses on the law side of things, because ultimately it asks us to think more broadly about what public safety means and the ways in which we can think about policing as one component of public safety. But there are other components of public safety as well, which is, again, as Chief Anderson mentioned, it means investing in community resources that can do things like combat crime as well. And so this is an area of potential, hopefully fruitful research for us in the Academy for Justice, and for law professors everywhere, honestly.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, we've got Chris Burbank who's joined us. Hi, Chris.
Hello, I so apologize. This was not on my schedule at all. So I'm a little casual, especially compared to my other panelists here, but at least I made it.
Well, we're glad you did, and I certainly don't mind the casual atmosphere, and it helps with a rigorous discussion, right? All right, so let's turn to Chris. We'll put you on the spot right away.
Okay.
So Chris is the Vice President for Law Enforcement Strategy at the Center for Policing Equity, and he's the former Chief of Police in Salt Lake City. So your nonprofit research group specializes in measuring bias in policing, if my understanding is correct. Can you tell us? Great. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the data is telling us, an overview maybe or any new trends that you can share?
Well, so I think not surprising to anyone is that the data, right, shows that there is disparity in the numbers across the nation, right? It doesn't matter where you're looking at, what city you're looking at. In fact, one of the things that we tell people right away when we go to work with the police agency, because we sign on with individual police agencies to work with them, is we are going to find some disparity in your numbers. More importantly, what is the underlying cause of that? So from a statistical perspective, right, the disparities are simply the numbers don't match up to what you would expect, right? It doesn't necessarily mean it's racist or it's biased even, but it doesn't match up. So what is important to us is then what is the underlying cause of this disparity and how can we make changes? And so some of the things that we look at, one of the things that is most notable in the data that we look at is that as a Black man in this country, you are about 8 times more likely to be asked for a consent search. And when you look at the efficacy of that effort, right, the times that the officer is correct in their assessment and asking and finds contraband or weapons or something that would indicate criminal activity, drops well below 3% and hovers right around 1%. This is stop and frisk in New York City. Conversely, when you look at white males in the country who are asked for consent search, in many cities, the efficacy rate jumps to 25%. Now, that doesn't mean you have a bunch of white guys running around committing crimes in it, but the scrutiny that goes into asking a white man in this country can we search you tonight, is much more robust and relies on good police observations, right? Observations of criminal behavior. This is criminal profiling, not racial profiling, right? They're basing it on this is the activity I'm observing, so thus I'm going to act, as opposed to this is the color of your skin and this is where you might be standing tonight. Now, very simply, right, we can do away with consent searches. Now, this makes police officers crazy wild when I start talking like this because, oh, it's a tool, it's everything else. I see the chief down here shaking his head at me a little bit, right? It does cause great amount of concern and nervousness in this because it is absolutely a tool that police have used historically to investigate further into what you would call the hunch or the idea or the suspicion. But given our current environment, and the access to e-warrants and how fast you can get those, there's different ways to do this. Or simply eliminate, right, and say, we're not going to do consent searches, we're going to do informed consent searches, where you hand the individual a piece of paper that says, you understand your constitutional rights under the Fourth Amendment, that you can say no to me tonight. And I can't use that as a basis to then develop more probable cause in order to search you. Having these rights in mind, do you want to search? And that begins to balance out this disparity. But doing nothing, right? You start with disparity and you look, this may be biased in who we're asking, where we're asking it at, and then doing nothing about it over time when you recognize this, well, then that absolutely turns into what we would consider racist attitude or behavior.
Thank you. Anyone want to weigh in on consent searches?
I can provide a bit of a perspective with respect to Texas, which I think fortunately is unique, somewhat unique anyway. And that is that in Texas, you could be arrested for any Class C misdemeanor, which is traffic violations and some other things, but broken tail light, failure to signal. And of course, this goes back to the Sandra Bland case that some of you may be familiar with in 2015. She sadly passed away in the jail, had a mental health problem, but she was pulled over for failing to signal a lane change. And so the question really is with the consent search, the reason this relates to that is this allows officers to say, if you don't consent, I'm going to take you downtown for this traffic violation. And so I think it's important that we make sure that at a minimum, this isn't, there can't be this type of pressure, this leveraging of, what of course is some would say a preempt, used, these things are used to pull people over as kind of in some instances, as a way to just try to find something else. And so I think that we have to be very careful at a minimum in that regard. And of course, legislation's pending this session in Texas to preclude these arrests for fine-only traffic offenses unless there's a danger to the officer or breach of the peace.
So let's jump on if I can for a minute. All right, traffic stops. There is no scientific correlation between the act of writing a ticket and improved safety on a roadway. And there's tremendous disparity in tickets across the nation. And then when you consider the fact that, if I get a $150 speeding ticket, or probably anyone on my panel, we're a little upset with that, but we are capable of paying that ticket and avoiding some of the things Marc talked about. If you are in a position that you can't afford to pay the ticket, you're debating rent and childcare and everything else that falls into that category, maybe you're unemployed at the moment, the consequence for that same ticket is much more significant. You can be jailed for it. It can be failure to appear. Your car can be impounded. So justice is not equal in that circumstance. But more importantly, imagine the millions of dollars of expense that go into any given roadway in the city in which you live over the last 10 years, right? Officers are the most expensive resource that we have on a city budget, usually making 50 to 60% of the budget up. And you ask yourself, with all that impact, with all the consequence to society and the inequity that it creates, do people still speed on that roadway today? And the answer is absolutely yes. So we haven't changed behavior, which is what I believe the goal of policing is. And in fact, the officers have to hide in the alleyways in order to allow the people to commit this horrible violation that's unsafe, in order to write them a ticket. when we know, right, scientific evidence that if you put speed boards out that flash your speed, if you make changes to the roadway, such as curves or roundabouts, speed bumps, this slows traffic down, it changes behavior, and oh, by the way, a speed bump does not care what color your skin is.
All right, so let's go down this road, so to speak, forget the pun, a little bit, because what you're talking about has a lot to do with just the way we approach policing, right? And what the job entails, what it should entail, what the role of policing is. And I'd love to talk a little bit more about police reform. And I'm going to direct this at Chief Anderson, but the rest of you feel free to weigh in on this. Can you tell us a little bit about the reform efforts in Rochester? And for those in the audience who aren't aware of what's happening in your city, if you can give us a brief overview of what the city's doing, and then, if you would, also tack on what you think about those efforts.
Sure, thank you. So in New York City, we have what's called the Executive Order 203. Every jurisdiction or every organization within New York is looking at police reform in a way to try to modify our practices. Now, in Rochester, we just completed our final draft approved by the Counsel that speaks specifically how we are reforming our organization. Now, in a brief sentence, obviously, or a brief conversation, there's a lot to talk about. But for the most part, what we're doing is we're reinvigorating our policies to meet some of the concerns that the community has. For example, we talked about the duty to intervene, which is part of our reform efforts. We're talking about how we respond to individuals in crisis, where we're modifying our practices with mental hygiene. In New York, they used to use, at least in our city, what was called a mental hygiene arrest. And so the police officers would arrest people in distress, as opposed to using the code in a way to detain and get the individual's help. So we're reforming and modifying that practice. We're looking at a number of different things with respect to how we handle juveniles, the contact we have, whether or not we consider them to be those that are arrested. We're using our reform to address how we deal with the adolescent brain, so that the police officers understand that when they come in contact with young people, that they may have to take a different approach with respect to how they're thinking and how we arrest them, or how we get them resources if there is a need for arrest, and whether or not a young juvenile or an adolescent even needs to be arrested in the first place. We're looking at what we're doing with respect to protests and how we use gas, whether we've changed our process and our practices to making sure that we don't treat the community as they may feel as they are combatants, but finding a way for them to be able to express themselves in a way that merits respect, while also putting in place ways to listen to their concerns and then implementing what they're telling us as a way to modify the police department's response and to address our community policing. So all in all, when I think about reform as it is today, is it is an opportunity for us to get the community more involved in changing the culture of policing. Policing needs to change, and reform allows for us to take a critical look at what the community, our business sectors, and getting police officers sitting at the table to redesign and reimagine policing in a way that meets our current needs.
And are you happy with how, like, in its current form? Do you think it goes far enough? Do you think it needs to go further?
There's so much that we need to do. There's a lot we need to do with respect to the reform efforts to determine if we're going to hit the mark. Right now, there are things that I see that are on the table that I don't agree with, quite frankly. And then there are many things that I see that I do agree with. some agencies are looking at departments where they're totally revamping the police departments. And so those are things that we have to really take a critical look at and take a look at the impact that has on the community at large. Other agencies are taking a look at, absolute immunity. We're looking at ways in which police officers can be sued for doing their job. I understand that the concern with respect to that, but there's a lot of things that can place our police officers and those that pay our city taxes at risk. So I think the answer is that there are some changes. And let me say this real quickly, because we're talking about stops as well as consent searches. Many agencies are talking about what we can do with consent searches, but I don't think the answer is that we get rid of consent searches. There's an inference that when a police officer stops you, you cannot deny consent. We have to do a better job making sure that community members know that they do not have to allow a police officer to consent. And who can better tell them that than police officers themselves? But we also need to make sure that police officers use the ability to gain consent in a way where it's prudent and when it's necessary in order to articulate clearly why we're asking for their consent and the nature of our consent. And that's where I think the changes are. And that's part of reform that I think needs to change.
Yeah, and I'll just weigh in a little bit on that. I think you asked a great question, which was kind of like, how do we know if what we're doing is working? And the Chicago Police Department, for example, you can go on their website and look a lot at many performance measures, including trust in the community. And you can look at trust by sector, which sectors of the city, to what degree they say they trust police, and a range of other measurements, obviously crime rates. But, the percent of crimes solved, particularly serious ones, is very important. A lot of times not enough resources go into that. But and one of the things we've seen is the programs involving credible messengers, in some cases partnering with police, but in Baltimore, Ready Chicago program, some very positive results from those. And I really think the thin blue line is a bad metaphor, because it's about co-producing public safety, that, unless citizens report crimes, unless they serve as witnesses, you're not going to get the kind of results that we need. So I do think that we ought to have a lot of transparency, including, you should be able to go on these a police website and find out, how many complaints were there about use of force, and how many were validated. And obviously we know that a pretty small percentage of officers account for a lion's share of unjustified or excessive uses of force. And then it's very difficult due to some of these collective bargaining agreements to actually discipline or terminate them. So that must be addressed as well.
If I can jump in here real quick, I just wanted to point out how much the reforms that are happening in Rochester are great examples of what needs to be happening, which is reforms that are driven not necessarily by legal regulation, but that are driven by the departments themselves, are driven by sort of public sentiment and politics. I think policy plays so much more of a role than law does in the way in which we regulate policing. One of the downsides to policing over the last 40 years or so has been the view that constitutional law doesn't just set a baseline, but establishes the standard practices for policing. And that's not really what constitutional law is good at. So a good example of this is, we've been talking about consent searches, right? Consent searches are permissible under constitutional law in a large number of circumstances. Stop and frisks actually sort of lower the floor for the amount of suspicion necessary before police officers can get sort of involved in the privacy and liberty of individuals. Those are baselines that are really low, honestly. And so seeing departments like Rochester, they're determined to take a step up and hold themselves to a higher standard because of public opinion, because of public perception of what's going on. I think that's the best approach we're going to have to regulating police. I think that for too long we've looked at it as an issue of, what can the law do here? And the answer is that the law has just failed. It hasn't done enough to regulate police departments, and we have to turn to the sort of tide of public sentiment. So we're in an optimistic moment in that there is a lot of public sentiment right now to get these reforms done. But as Chief Anderson said at the beginning, there's also 18,000 different law enforcement agencies across the country. And one of the downsides that we're facing is that so many of these reforms are going to have to be department by department, sort of piecemeal reforms. But I think this is a good example of one of the things that's frustrating about my angle on all of this is that as a law professor, there's so much that the law can't do or can't reach here. And that to really get policing and public safety aligned in the way that we want it to, it's going to take a lot more political will and policy work at the level of departments. And so it's great to see Rochester making the reforms that it's making.
Well,
And what a fascinating time. It's just what a fascinating time for researchers as well to take a look at these reforms and see what the impact is, and to hold them up. And as journalists, for us, it's a great time to really put the spotlight on, you know, these various departments that are trying these things, and see how the community is reacting, and take a look at the research and take a look at that data. I'm sorry, Chris, what were you going to say?
No, I was just going to say the chief made a comment that is very important to note, right? And that was reimagine policing, right? We've been reforming, at least in my lifetime, policing in my career since Rodney King, right? And we want to train people on bias or anti-bias. We want to de-escalate. None of this is new. What we've made the mistake of doing is saying we're going to do the same thing, we're just going to do it differently. Well, now is the time to actually reimagine and say, you know what? Maybe we shouldn't do the same thing. We are so obsessed with that 30 seconds or 3 minutes, or the case in Minneapolis, that 8 minutes of time. And we want to change that. What can we do to change that outcome? More importantly, why are the police there in the first place? Maybe we shouldn't be showing up on these at all. And if you're not there, you don't have the negative outcomes that we see time and time again. So we need to reimagine, right? All that we do, because this is more about what is the expectation of society and the police, as opposed to here's what the baseline is because we've always done it this way. And Ben's point, right? If we are using the Constitution as the standard, right? Those are designed to prevent people from violating the law. Your policy should be way far away from that. You don't want your officers even bumping up against that line. But that's a mistake with deadly force as well across the nation.
All right, I would love to, we've got some questions from the group, so I'd love to do some of those, and we can circle back on some of these issues because it's fascinating stuff. All right, we've got Sandra Whitfield, who says, Chief Anderson and any of the other panelists, there's been a major call to defund the police. Some say it's merely a bad and inaccurate name. Reimagining policing, which is a term you've already used, is really more accurate. Describe to me what you support in terms of change and reimagining polices. We've touched on this a little bit, but anything you want to add?
You know, one thing that I believe is true about any of us is that we can take this and apply it to us all. If you give me your checkbook, I'll tell you what's important to you. You know, and if we look at it, we're going to know. And it's important that the community, as Chris indicated, and we're talking about reform, and even when we're talking about defunding, what is important to the community? The community has to be involved with respect to what they think we need to do. And as they do that, we have to reallocate funding in a way that serves the community at large. But we have to temper that. So when we look at the funding, yes, there are things that we should not be responding to. There are cases with mental illness where we should not be responding to. If we believe that it is important for the police to have a frequency of interaction with young people at community centers, and young people working with kids at football games, or teaching them how to play instruments, or many other things that we believe will help policing, we should reallocate funding in order to allow that, but not defund the police department, but place an emphasis on training the police officers to reimagine where we're going. And that reimagining has to come from the community at large, because it is the time for the community to assess what we've done in the past and carve out a new plan for us. And some of that, only some of that can be done by way of reallocating funds, which is similar to defunding, but it's ensuring that we're doing what is needed to make sure we're creating both trust and legitimacy.
Well, and I would add, if you look at it, cities that have really high crime rates, like Baltimore and Chicago, they have, 2 to 3 times as many police per capita as in Austin, Texas, for example, where I am. And so there's a reason for that, right? But if you kind of unpack this and say, what could we do to change the circumstances so you don't have as many people getting involved in criminal activity, particularly serious criminal activity. And then you start to look at things like children who are exposed to trauma, exposed to violence. You look at things like street lighting. There's a lot of research that if you address the environmental factors, that you can also, particularly with regard to like street crimes of opportunity, they don't just move, they actually don't occur at all. And so I think too often we've taken a very kind of deterministic and individualistic approach to saying, of course, people should be held accountable for their crimes. But if you look at their issues that affected their upbringing, issues in their environment, if we change some of those factors, we will therefore have less delinquency among young adults, which is really, it's young people that account for a disproportionate share of crimes. And then we won't need as many police, especially as we refocus them on these core public safety areas and then use alternative responses. So I do think it's a holistic approach, and certainly it does involve not just the silo of policing, but what we bring to bear in terms of resources and attention to these other aspects that ultimately contribute to criminal activity.
Well, and we make the mistake of believing that police activity has some impact on crime. There's no scientific correlation between those two things. And so when you look and say police activity drives the crime, it does not. Right? There are social factors such as jobs, healthcare, education, have much more impact on the crime rate than police activity ever does. But we don't use science to then evaluate police activity. Does it change the outcome? We incarcerated more people than in the history of the world during the 90s. We had more police officers on the street, more people arrested, right? And violent crime soared, added crime in all categories. Look years later at economic crisis, 40,000 fewer police officers 1 year over next on the street. Crime dropped dramatically. Right? There are other factors at play that we don't, or we shouldn't just throw everything behind the police department and say, oh, crime went up a tick, so we need 20 more police officers on the street doing this. No, as Marc said, there are other things that impact this that have more impact on the outcome. Right? And this is especially notable when we compare ourselves to other nations throughout the world.
If I can, I hear this often. We talk about whether the police contact or relationship has any anecdotal evidence that suggests that it has an impact on crime. So let me pose this to you, because it actually does. Community policing is kind of like a lighthouse. In many ways, you ask, how many lives does a lighthouse save? People just don't know. So oftentimes people that crunch numbers, they want tangible evidence to demonstrate that it's changed. But it does change. Let me tell you how it changes. I grew up in the housing projects. When you have police officers that come in contact with you and they have a positive relationship with you and they talk to you about not engaging in crime, and you gain a relationship with that police officer and you respect that police officer and you modify your behavior, you cannot place that in some type of database. When you're contacting people on a traffic stop and you're having a talk with a little kid where mom says he keeps taking his seatbelt off, and you say, little one, why are you taking your seatbelt off? And you have that conversation with the kid, what happens is not only the parent leaves, it may not change the behavior of the kid, but it changes the behavior of the parent. And then the parent starts to talk to other people, which creates a positive thought process about the police and a positive thought process about the next encounter with the police. You cannot measure those things. So community policing cannot be measured. It is frequency of interaction in a positive way that helps to drive the numbers down, not the number of police officers making contacts.
So,
And I would just add, there is a study of the public housing projects in Los Angeles where officers were assigned for 5 years. Not only did those type of activities like helping kids walk to school, but also real community engagement, sessions where they listened to residents about what they wanted from the police and give them a voice in the practices. And it did drive down crime compared to the same projects that weren't part of this, the same public housing developments that weren't part of this trial. So I do think that it can make a difference. And there also is some evidence that visible police officers do deter some street crime, just as street lighting can. But I also do agree with part of what Chris said, that it's not the only. There's many other ways of preventing crime beyond police visibility too, and we do need to kind of do more empirical research about which delivers the most bang for the buck. It's probably a mix.
Yeah, I mean, if I can jump in on this real quick, just to point out that, I mean, one of the things that we need to consider to Chief Anderson is what are the alternatives, right? So it might be that police officer making a community impact, making a good connection with somebody is beneficial. But is it more beneficial in terms of our bang for the buck than investing in schools, for example, right? Is education of that young man going to end up being a better deterrent for criminality? Actually, Christina, you started this off by saying that you wanted to talk about something like police effectiveness versus fair policing. And I feel like that's a mistaken, framework for this, because ultimately, in my view of it, police effectiveness is obsolescence, right? Police, ultimately, the goal should be zero crime, which means zero arrests, which means zero incarcerated people. And so when we're talking about effective policing, we have to figure out, well, what's going to drive down crime rate to the point that we don't need police anymore? And the answer is not necessarily that it's police that do that, right? It might be that some of these other investments are things that can do that. And some of this comes from my own background. One of the things that I study is the policing of homelessness, right? And homelessness is a social problem that doesn't get fixed by arresting individuals who are homeless, right? It doesn't get improved, yet it's a crime. It's a crime to do a lot of the things that you can't avoid doing if you're homeless, including sleeping in public places, some urinating in public places, asking for food, asking for money. Those things can get you locked up. And that it turns out that when we actually sit down and we look at it, it can be cheaper for the public to simply provide housing to homeless individuals than it is to constantly arrest them. And yet it's really, really hard to get the public behind that. So there's something about our fixation with using police to stop the things that we don't like. That's what we need to break away from. When it comes to reimagining policing, there's something about getting out of that mindset that the police are society's sort of cleanup squad to fix everything that's wrong with society, right? We need to get back into thinking about, well, what are the things that are actually going to drive away the social problems that we don't want to have? And it might be that it takes investing in precisely the people that otherwise we label as criminal.
So let me just jump in here, because I don't disagree with the chief or with Marc, right? The things they described, right? What the chief described is what the police should be doing that is positive. Why don't we measure that? It is measurable. We don't even emphasize it in most. Now, again, chief, I'm not pointing at you because it sounds like you are emphasizing. But when you look, what do we judge? How many arrests did you make? How many tickets did you make? Right? These are the criteria for policing. How much force did you use or not use? Right? I want to know all those intangible things. Those are where you put your money. No longer are we going to show up and dressed in riot gear. This is how we're going to address them because this is better for the community. Right? That is exactly what we're talking about when we say there's no correlation between the police activity that we expect. We have desensitized society to the notion of anyone who makes me feel uncomfortable, I call the police and the police take them away. That is wrong. And it has resulted in the circumstance that we find ourselves in now. If policing had taken the turn that Chief Anderson described 30 years ago, I don't think we'd be having this panel.
All right, so fascinating discussion on that thread, and thank you all for jumping in. I would like to get to a couple more of the questions from the audience. I'm going to do a little bit of a combo. So, this is a super easy softball question, but I'd love to tackle race. obviously kidding about that. So Nikki Roberts asked, in your opinion, who should lead racial sensitivity training for law enforcement and why? But I'd love to combo that and would love to hear your perspectives about, not just racial sensitivity, but the makeup of departments and, whether they should reflect the communities, the importance of that, how much emphasis we should put on that. But so any of you want to tackle this super simple issue?
If you couldn't tell by now, I'm always willing to jump in on these issues. One of the things that I think is important is we've made the mistake historically of viewing racism from the notion of hearts and minds, right? Ideally, if we're going to solve racism, we want to change everyone's minds, right? And so that they feel differently about other people, right? That's the pie in the sky goal. However, if we look at it from a behavioral standpoint, we can study behavior. It's very hard to change your attitude, who you are, but I can absolutely regulate your behavior. And in doing so, I reduce the opportunity for you to insert bias or racism into the equation. And so that's where our focus needs to be, right? We want the best trained police officers, but we have for years, right? It's been sensitivity training, cultural awareness training, anti-bias training, right? We could just go down the list. We've never measured if that actually worked. Well, obviously it didn't, because we're still in the same situation. But when you start down the road of saying you will not engage in this activity, whether that's consent searches, tickets, or right, you can come up with your whole criteria. That then changes the outcome. And you have tangible reduction in force, you have tangible reduction in officer injuries, and you have tangible reduction in tickets and arrests. And crime tends not to go up. The challenge, and why I say tends, because at any moment in time, right, we can say, and it's a mistake we make, oh, crime went up from yesterday, right? We had one crime and it was more than yesterday, so then crime's up. Or the last, 6 months or year over year, right? But when we look at a trend line, it's not this, it's relatively flat. And that is the difference that we tend not to look at, and we get panicky and say, okay, we've got this huge problem. Now let's throw lots of police. Let's do zero tolerance. Everyone gets a ticket. Everyone gets searched. And then what we establish is an us against them. And usually them, traditionally in this country, have been Black individuals in our nation.
Well, I appreciate the way you view things, Chris. It's interesting to hear that viewpoint, and I will just tell you this: there's a lot of do's and don'ts to the police departments. Don't do this, do this, and a lot of policies. And many of the good cops out here, many of the police officers, the good ones, they don't know the rules. You know why? They don't get in trouble. And many of the officers that do know all the rules is because they get in trouble. Now, why is that? We talk about race and things. It's really about character, hiring people that care, regardless to what race they are. I listened to you today, Chris. You strike me as someone that would be really good to work with people of color, yet you don't look like me. So do you have to be a certain race in order to be effective? I say that we have to start with getting the community involved in the hiring practice and hiring people that get it, that are relatable, that have the skill sets we need to address the concerns we have. And if you're working in a minority community, oftentimes many minority police officers understand that community. But if you have not, does that mean you can't learn? Or do you not have the zeal and passion to do it? So we can't regulate it by policy. We know that culture eats policy for breakfast. What we can do is we can regulate it by getting good quality people that care and creating a culture in a law enforcement community and department that's inclusive, that respects people, respects women, respects law enforcement of all different variations of race and perspectives. And we have to weed that out in the beginning and make sure we socialize them to be the types of police officers we see in the community. And that's how we deal with the race issue, in my view.
I'm curious if any of you have seen examples of departments that, I don't want to say get that right, but have, you know, are departments we should look at in terms of baking in that culture that you talk about. Are there departments out there? Are there policies out there that you all have seen that we can take a look at?
I think you made a great point about, you know, starting with hiring. And I know a couple of years ago, Baltimore put in place basically a personality inventory, because if somebody's got a hair trigger temper, they might be fine working in an office somewhere, but not as a police officer. So, you know, initial training is great, but if you have to make sure you're dealing with someone who has the type of personality to be a successful officer. And, you know, in terms of race, obviously the data is very clear, especially as it relates to drugs, that, you know, the races, people of all races use drugs in the same amount, and but the disparities in arrest are quite large. They have declined slightly. Some of that certainly is that people with money get their drugs surreptitiously, or more likely to. Officers, if they're, you know, more likely to be in communities that have high rates of serious crime, then they may come across someone using marijuana, which is why we shouldn't be arresting people for marijuana, but also we should be diverting people for other drugs as well. But the other issue is, of course, you have, in terms of, for example, traffic offenses, people in poverty, and many of which are African American or other people of color, they're less likely to have insurance, or they're more likely to have an expired inspection sticker. These types of poverty-based related violations that lead to them being pulled over and so forth. And then, you know, you just get into the fact that there's so much discretion on the part of officers, and what they may see as suspicious. And you have the academic research showing that, for example, people view Black boys as older than they are, as more threatening than they are, than white people, or you know. So I think that there's so much there, but some of it certainly can be addressed through training, but a lot of it requires, as Chris said, changing laws and practices so that we don't expose people to potential consequences at the sole discretion of an officer, when we know that discretion in many instances is not going to be applied equally.
Well, yeah, and if I can jump in on this, I mean, I want to echo Chris's point about, you know, one of the ways that we can address racism is we can address practices, right? And this means stuff like, you know, the places that we designate high crime neighborhoods and that we tend to over police as a result of that, right? Tend to be non-white neighborhoods. We keep data on police interactions in some cities. New York, for example, had extensive data on their stop and frisk practices, but never sat down and said, well, why is it that we are so disproportionately targeting men of color, especially when the number of those that end up being fruitless searches was so high for young men of color, right? So if we can do more with data, do more in terms of looking at what actual practices are, and then figuring out the places in which those practices deviate from what would be expected in a purely sort of random situation, we can start to identify either the officers or the policies that are getting us to these sort of racially disproportionate outcomes. You know, one of the things that I recently read some research on that I thought was interesting is that traffic stops of men of color were lower proportionally after dark than during the daytime, right? And the thought process there is that during the daytime, officers are making pretextual stops of men of color because they can see who's driving. And at night, they don't necessarily have the ability to see who's driving. And so suddenly the rate at which young men of color are being stopped goes way down, right? Those sorts of actual sort of tracking practices is one of the best ways that we can figure out, well, sort of who's responsible and which practices, which officers and which policies are responsible for us having a disproportionate impact on the basis of race. And so I think that, you know, I think it's essential. I agree with Chief Anderson that this isn't just about, you know, a statistical hiring practice and that your culture is going to make a big difference to your police department. But I think that one of the best ways at getting at this stuff is just to have more data and be more mindful of it, right? Actually follow where the data leads you so that you can start to change the practices that lead to the disproportionate outcomes.
Well, and there's really good research, right, that shows if an officer has more education, they're less likely to use force. If they start the career later in life, they're less likely to use force. If they're a female, they're less likely to use force. If they work directly for a female, they're less likely to use force. So we can now start to build, this is what a good police officer looks like. Why are we not hiring those people? And interestingly enough, people would have listened to my first comments and say, well, he's anti-police. And it's like, no, I want to pay the police more. In fact, I want Chief Anderson to compete with Google because he's paying so well and the job's so good, right? Not other jobs, right? We want the best and brightest to come in the door to work across this nation as police officers. Change the expectation, change what we're willing to pay and what the circumstance of the job is, right? We can do that. We know what a good police officer is. Let's start changing what policing is so that we're able to bring those people in the door.
All right. So we have, I guess it's now a 3-minute warning. We're going to try to squeeze out just one more question. I'm going to pick, I don't want to say easy, but one of the more simple questions. So we've got Tim Igo with the Arizona Attorney Magazine, who asked for any panelist, are there any examples of reform-minded police unions in the country you could point us to?
I think the Glendale Police Department is reform-minded, and that's in Arizona. And I'll tell you why. They have 2 unions there, and they call them associations, and they meet with members of the community, and they talk about things that have an impact on reform, and they're balanced. They talk about how it impacts the police, and they talk about how the reform efforts can be better suited in order for the police department to have a better response.
All right. Any other suggestions? Any other, in the 2 minutes we have left, any other last thoughts, anything we need to circle back on? I know I feel like every time, people leave panels, like, oh, I wish I would have been able to say this one thing.
Well, let me just say, I think it's important to remember that, like, I think no one is suggesting police are worse people than anybody else, people in any other occupation. It's just when they make errors, there's graver consequences. And I think that goes to what Chris was saying about making sure we do hire the best and brightest, train them well, and that we, back to what we've kind of all focused on, is that we really narrow the mission to those functions that police have a comparative advantage in relative to other types of responders and other social interventions.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that I think, the one change that we haven't talked about yet today, but that I'd like to get people thinking about, is simply that we have too many criminal laws. And so part of what we're tasking police with doing is too many things, not all of which are equally important, and not all of which require police response. Chris gave the example of, we use police to write traffic tickets, and yet it doesn't seem to have any impact on our speeds, right? Well, part of the question is, do we actually care enough about speeds to make that a criminal matter? Is that really something that we should be using police to do? If we're not interested in changing speeds, then we don't need police out there doing that. And I think there's a lot of small things like that. Many of our misdemeanors are things that it's not at all clear that society cares that much about changing so much as we care about controlling, regulating, ordering. And so we might want to start by thinking about, well, what activities can we decriminalize and just remove from police jurisdiction that way?
All right, well, I see Stephen has jumped on, and I think he's the man with the hook. So I just wanted to say thank you all. The panelists, you all have been fantastic, and for the questions from the group, very much appreciate it. Fascinating discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. And I echo that. This has been an extraordinary conversation, and with 4 people into an hour, we got an amazing amount done. I mean, there's still a lot more to cover. We have a few questions left in our window, and we will bundle them and we'll send them to you for answering later to our speakers. We're going to take a 30-minute virtual lunch break now. Give everybody a chance to stand up, go outside. I know the weather is beautiful out in in the Southwest. It's not, it's actually turning a little bit nicer out here in New York. So please stand up, stretch your legs, and come back to us in about a half hour for our next sessions. And thank you again.
Thank you all.